So, why do casters feel so much more powerful and scale so much harder than martial classes in D&D 5th edition? It's kind of an interesting topic, and one that I'm just a little afraid to touch on because, well, I usually don't talk shop about mechanics. I'll mention them, sure, but anyone who's watched enough of my videos can pretty easily suss out that I am much more about the empathetic and higher concept stuff of tabletop RPGs. And that's opposed to the nitty-gritty rules. And that's for two reasons. One, I'm not really qualified to talk about rules since there are so many other awesome YouTubers out there who have game design degrees and hours of content on this stuff already. And two, well, it's no secret that the Dungeons & Dragons community can get kinda toxic really fast when you say something about rules that they disagree with. But I haven't strayed from controversial topics in the past, and I don't really intend to specifically talk about balance, more just the reason of why this issue exists and how dungeon masters and players can offset this in order to have the best game possible. Good deal? Good deal. So with that out of the way, let's get to the topic of the video and discuss spellcasting and why it scales so strangely in D&D 5th edition. I want to talk about the weave of magic at the very lifeblood of the worlds of D&D. I want to talk about magic casters. So let's talk about that. When magic was first introduced into Dungeons & Dragons, it was in a small volume known as Men and Magic, in which it had about 10 to 12 pages on the interworkings of magics and how they worked. Now, something that is important to note is the fact that first edition's Dungeons & Dragons was a far cry from the D&D we know today. And so this system that was introduced back then is essentially long gone from the game we know today. However, just because it's gone does not mean it has not had its lasting effects on the game, and there are still concepts and rules that were inspired by what was created back then in what we do today. The most notable and largest inspiration for the strange comparison to the power of martial classes late game versus the power of magic casters is this line from the original Men and Magic volume. If you survive those vulnerable early levels, spells could grant godlike powers, like the reality warping wish spell, which does exactly what you think it does. A maxed level fighter might be Achilles, but a level 20 magic user was Zeus. See, in the earlier editions of D&D, all classes were not created equal, because back then the assumption was honestly that your character probably wasn't going to get to higher levels. In the game back then, when a character died, it was gone and done for, and you had to roll up a new character and start at level 0. Which of course sounds harsh, yeah, but the reason is because it was set up to be that way back then. That's what the game was about. It wasn't necessarily about crafting an epic narrative, it was more about seeing how high a level you could get your character and how far along into the world's hierarchy they could become. Nowadays, however, it's much more about the storytelling part, and so character death and restarting at 0 is considered a much bigger deal. The reason I'm covering this concept is to point out that death was very much an option, and for early level spellcasters, they just didn't have hardly anything. It was not easy to recover the ability to cast spells back then, so when you did so, you were done. No more spells to cast. Better go cower and hope that the fighter, who didn't run out of the ability to swing his sword, could handle things from there. They were almost a little useless at the early levels. And the reason that people would choose to play a spellcaster is so that they could invest in this and hopefully keep the character alive long enough to reach the late levels, at which point they would be much, much more powerful. Essentially, it was a gamble. Can I keep this character alive long enough to become more powerful than all the rest of my party members? And that's really just what spellcasters were back then, an incredibly easy to kill gamble that would hopefully pay off with awesome power later in the game. We can honestly see the inspiration of that system in the current edition of D&D today. At early level, spellcasters only have a very limited amount of spell slots, and that's really all they get. Then, as they level up, they quickly get access to more and more spell slots at higher levels until they pretty much just end up passing the martial classes. This is meant to be a sort of mirror of the original system. The casters start small, then grow large. The reason this becomes a point of contention in the 5e community is because, well, it's kind of like they forgot that people don't really get to level 20 all that much. I mean, it's no secret that most games never really get near that level. When these classes were first created, they assumed that people would get towards level 20, but as time got on, they realized that most campaigns don't actually reach that level. But that doesn't change the fact that these classes were originally made with the intention of reaching level 20. In fact, Wizards of the Coast pretty much actively ignore any support at higher levels of play because they are aware of the fact that hardly any campaigns actually get there. And to be clear, that's not really a bash on Wizards of the Coast. I mean, I wish they didn't do that, but it's a smart business decision. No point in wasting resources on something most of your players won't actually get to enjoy. It is, however, ignoring the fact that that's how the classes were balanced. And this leads to this sort of awkward disparity when you compare a fighter and a wizard at level 4 and a fighter and a wizard at level 14 or 15. But at the same time, the creatives behind D&D 5e have stated on multiple occasions that they attempt to balance the classes by having them all stay roughly the same amount of power throughout the level, so no player ever feels like they're underperforming, no matter what level your game is running at. So there seems to be an attempt to maintain the old school concept of spellcasters are a little weak at earlier levels for later level gain, alongside all classes should feel roughly equal. Definitely feels like there's some sort of conflicting concepts there, and that's not even going into the fact that in older editions they had much different rules on spell slots and how many spells you could cast. That doesn't even apply to the current edition. So where does this knowledge leave us? Well, it leaves us with a little bit of understanding as to why spellcasters seem to take off in later levels, and why martial classes end up stagnating somewhat. But it doesn't fix the issue, now does it? Again, it's not really like martial classes are weak at higher levels. Well, I'll just go ahead and quote what I quoted earlier because it really sums it up. A maxed level fighter might be Achilles, but a level 20 magic user is Zeus. Also, to be clear, I got that quote from the Wikipedia page on D&D's history. I'm not actually sure if it's a direct quote from the original D&D source material, but I do like it and I think it fits my point. Anyways, so yeah, spellcasters just ultimately end up showing up the martial classes, which can be kind of discouraging. So, is there anything that could be done about this? Well, kinda. I mean, we as DMs and players always have the ability to homebrew rules, but a lot of the time that doesn't work out so well, since we're not all game designers and we can accidentally make things unbalanced even more than they already were. So what is my personal solution? Well, if we're going to compare martial classes to that of Achilles and spellcasters to that of Zeus, I think the solution, surprisingly, is right there. What is one thing that the heroes of ancient myths and legends did over and over again in order to face impossible odds and even overcome the gods? On rare occasions, anyways. They used their incredible martial strength to outsmart opponents. Perseus did not defeat Medusa through pure brawn. He beheaded her by watching her reflection in his shield. How did Hercules defeat the Hydra? Not through pure brutality, but instead by realizing that he must use scorching flames to prevent its heads from regrowing. In legends, the heroes often stood opposed or on the same level as the gods, not through pure brutality, but cunning and creativity to supplement their strength. With this concept for the martial classes in my campaigns, I kept this in mind. Whenever the martial classes wanted to act, I would often wait and listen to see what their intention was and supplement this to its most logical conclusion. For example, there was a time where my fighter was fighting multiple trolls, and she took a swing at one and beat its armor class by about 12 or 13, and then rolled near max damage. Rather than just narrate the hit and be done with it, I asked myself, what does hitting that high above someone's armor class look like? What else could it do? And so I had the troll make a strength saving throw, which it failed, and had it get knocked prone. Now you have to be careful with this concept, because yes, the more you make allowances and be forgiving towards the martial classes, you run the risk of making your other players feel like they're being treated unfairly. You have to have player buy-in in order for this kind of thing to work. Otherwise, it might just come across as nothing more than favoritism, which is obviously less than ideal. But if your players are comfortable, this lets you see the true power of the martial classes. No, they can't shape reality like the spellcasters, they were never supposed to. But their physical prowess at higher levels should be something of legend. The strength and dexterity scores can only go up to 20. Yes, however, in my mind, the higher level they are, the more impressive their feats should be. And the further that 20 in strength or dexterity should be able to get them. Yes, they've reached the peak level that anybody could in this world without magic, but that doesn't mean that as they level up they don't learn how to use that more and more. Still, all of this ultimately amounts to this. As a dungeon master, it is up to you on how to handle this disparity between martials and spellcasters. But with some creativity, trust, and a whole lot of collaboration, I think it can turn out just fine. Really, it comes down to you and your players have to trust each other to be able to make this work, to be able to make the fighters feel useful. As your fighter or your barbarian or your ranger or your rogue has continued to level up, they have continued to learn. They know that what they have is their own physicality. So yes, while the wizard can warp reality itself and cause magnificent displays of power, your martial classes know how to use what they have. And so as they be creative and as they try and do things, work with them and understand that they always knew that this kind of power was probably out there. And they knew that they would have to be able to contend with it based off what they could do. So go out into the world and make it your own, you beautiful bastards. Don't forget to have a great day, and never forget to play your role. Thank you. Come again.